Okay, so welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and this is the virtual reading group of the Hannah Arendt Center here at Bard College. Um, we are in the midst of the book, The Promise of Politics, and a posthumously edited collection by Jerome Cohn, and then further in the midst of the long, I don't know what to call it, manuscript, unpublished manuscript that Arendt wrote in the 1950s, but never published, called Introduction into Politics, which we've been reading for the last few weeks. And today we're reading a long section in the middle of that essay, actually coming to the end of it. Next week will be our last discussion about this book and this essay, called The Question of War. For those who've read other later books of Arendt, you'll know that a lot of the material in this section on the question of war reappears in the beginning of her book on revolution. And so this is material that really 8 years later she'll publish in On Revolution. But here she develops this interest in war and the question of war from out of the question that governs this larger manuscript, Introduction into Politics, which is, what is politics and what is the meaning of politics, right? These are the questions that we've been asking so far. And remind ourselves that for her, politics is about plurality. It's about the fact that there are differences amongst us, that we are a multitude. And politics is about a space in which the multitude of different plural people comes together and forms a unity. And here's the kicker, without losing its plurality, without losing the differences that define it. And if we also recall from the earlier sessions on this manuscript, Arendt believes that there is a profound prejudice in the modern world against politics, against plurality, right? Against the idea that we should organize our lives through the engagement and encounter of equals of equals who are different and who disagree in a public sphere. She thinks that we don't like that. And there's a number of reasons we don't like that and that we're prejudiced against it. But one is simply that we're scared of it. Politics is terrifying because it actually means that people who disagree have to get together and figure out how to resolve their differences without violence, and that becomes something that is difficult, and especially at a time of nuclear weapons. All of our, and someone said last week, and I think that was a good point. Let's we still have nuclear weapons, and some of us still think they're dangerous, but let's not talk about nuclear weapons today, right? Let's talk about global warming, right? Do we want to leave global warming to the politics, to the political people, or would we rather, in our prejudices, as Arendt suggests, leave it to a bunch of scientifically trained expert bureaucrats to solve the problem? Who do we think is more likely to solve the problem well, right? Experts, or who will hopefully seek a kind of coherent scientific unity of opinion, or the masses brought in to argue about it. And she says that in general, we're suspicious of the masses brought in to argue about it. We don't like politics, and that's a large part of the prejudice. this section that we're going to read today on the question of war, she sets up by saying, in talking about politics, opinion matters, public opinion matters. And if you, at least in her time, she says, if you check with public opinion, they say that one of the main reasons politics matters today is because of the threat of war and atomic weapons. And we could add climate change or others. And these are a threat for all of humankind. And so she says, we have to ask the question of war, because that's what a lot of people think politics is about, when to go to war, right? I mean, we often in the United States, one of the things you hear presidents say often is, the ultimate decision of a president is, when to put people in harm's way, when to go to battle, when to fight a war. And so she says, this is a political question. And we need to ask, therefore, how war in the age of nuclear weapons and in the age of totalitarianism, and more specifically, I think, in the age of what she'll call total war here, and which her colleague Ernst Junger will call total mobilization. How does war in this modern age impact politics? So again, she's writing this in the early 1950s. Obviously, front and center in her head is Hiroshima, and she starts this off with Hiroshima, right? And she says that Hiroshima brought to our eyes the horror, two horrors, she said, right? One was that war could not only decimate a people, namely the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also that it could turn the world they inhabit into a desert. This is on page 154 in the book, but right at the beginning of this section on the question of war. What does she mean by that? I mean, I think we all know what she means by decimate a people, but turn the world they inhabit into a desert. The next few pages, I have to say, are a little bit difficult if you're not well versed in Arendt. It's one of the most difficult, I think. I think one of the most difficult ideas and concepts in Arendt's writing is the idea of process, which we will have to engage with when we get to part 3 of, the last part of the human condition, where she talks about it quite a lot. But for our purposes here, what she wants to say is that the hydrogen bomb is created by human beings, but that it unleashes a process into the world, namely nuclear energy, which otherwise is new, doesn't exist in the world, right? We don't usually have nuclear reactions on the world, maybe in the sun, but not in our human world. And that this new process that we unleash with the hydrogen bomb, she says, metaphorically speaking, is like an explosion, which is like a catastrophe. What is a catastrophe? Well, literally, it's a reversal of what is expected. And so such catastrophes like explosions, like the hydrogen bomb, don't lead to doom, she says, but to unexpected areas of progress. And the example she gives is the defeat of Germany, right? The defeat of Germany in World War II led unexpectedly to the German economic miracle. The idea that since so much was destroyed, they could rebuild their economy in a more modern way than the rest of Europe. And so she says the hydrogen bomb is also such an explosion or a catastrophe. It's a humanly created process. And the initial horror of the destruction that it brings opens, she says, onto a greater horror, which she calls the turning of the world into a desert. And by that, she means the death of politics. So that the hydrogen bomb and war in the nuclear age is an anti-politics. It's a destruction of politics. And that's what she now wants to elaborate on. So the first point that I think is important to realize is that she's talking here about this idea of total war. and she talks about it in a number of her books or essays. She takes it to some degree from, as I said before, Ernst Jünger, who wrote a very famous essay called "Die große Möbelmachung," the great mobilization. And in that essay, Jünger um, uh, articulates his idea of total mobilization, which is war in the modern age, which doesn't seek to accomplish limited ends, um, but seeks either to annihilate or to survive. And as a result, there are no moral limitations on it. You know, civilians become mobilized, therefore, civilians become legitimate targets. You can take out the power grids. Um, because war has reached such an existential question, Junger argues, and because the power grid, and it's not just me. You have an army out there, and two armies fight, and whoever wins, they go home, and they're the winner. You need a power grid. You need farms. You need food. You need clothes. You need supplies, and so all of that becomes fair game in total war. And Arendt and Junger are writing in the shadow of World War I and World War II, which were the first two total wars. And she says that in this world of total war, on page 159, she says war first truly ceases to be a means of politics, and as a war of annihilation begins to overstep the bounds set by politics and to annihilate politics itself. Right? So this is really an important. You have to understand this idea to understand all the difficult history she's about to go into. What she wants to say is that modern war as total war, there's this old phrase by Clausewitz, which I'm sure many of you have heard, that war is politics by other means, a continuation of politics by other means. When politics fails, we go to war in order to decide the question, and then we go back to politics. And what she says is, in the modern era, that's just not the case. It's about the destruction of politics. It's about annihilation. It's about making the world a desert, and therefore not actually after war, there's actually not a common new treaty or common new idea that emerges. We have simply a victor and someone who no longer exists. This idea of total war, she says, stands against the whole moral and political tradition of Western political theory. There have been limits on violence since at least Rome, and Roman thinking. The whole just war idea of Augustine was part of Christian and Roman political thinking and legal thinking and military thinking. And so she wants to say is that for most of Western history, war did not seek to destroy the defeated in a way that erased their historical and political reality in the world. And yet modern war increasingly does that. It seeks to kill the entire world of human relationships of the party that is vanquished. Genocide, therefore, becomes in some way the almost necessary outcome of modern warfare. Insofar as what modern warfare does is seek to not just win or get some power advantage or gain some territory, but wipe a civilization off the map. It becomes a kind of genocidal endeavor. And she takes this idea up again near the end of Eichmann in Jerusalem, where she seeks to define the genocide and argues that the real crime of genocide is not murdering lots of people, but murdering a people, and thus reducing the plurality of the world and taking away a people from the world. And so this is again a precursor of some of her thoughts in the Eichmann in Jerusalem book, written about 8 years later. She then says that since Western political theory and morality have sought to limit war from this total war idea, it's worth looking back at the Greek and Roman traditions in order to try and understand how they understood these questions of war and politics. And she says the sort of the great example of war in the ancient age was the Trojan War. And the Greeks annihilated Troy and wiped it out. And yet it was saved in two ways, right? One way it was saved was through the poetry of Homer, insofar as Homer created epics that not only celebrated the Greeks, but celebrated the Trojans. And so this idea of Homeric impartiality, which celebrates both Hector and Achilles, undoes the physical annihilation to some degree of Troy, to some degree. And let's just be clear, Arendt is clear that the Greeks saw war as anti-political. They saw it as wars of annihilation, and therefore they didn't think war was a political activity. They thought war was an activity of pure force, and was not a continuation of politics by other means. This distinction between impartiality and objectivity that she alludes to here is actually really important throughout her work, especially in her work in essays like Truth and Politics and others. The premise of impartiality is it doesn't seek objective truth, but it does seek to honor the perspectives of both sides. And it sees the battle between the Greeks and the Trojans and between Achilles and Hector as a model of how equals fight, and both are glorified in the fight, even though one has to win and one has to lose. Another aspect of this Greek impartiality is the political aptitude of phrenesis, which here she calls the cardinal virtue of political man. I'll just point out that in numerous places she says that courage is the cardinal virtue of politics. Arendt is not always consistent. We just have to accept that she speaks in these ways. She's an enthusiastic writer. That's one of the reasons I love her. But so one thing to think about is the connection between courage and phrenesis. That would be an excellent project, for example. Why is it that courage and phrenesis are both, for someone like Arendt, the cardinal political virtues? Phrenesis, for those who don't speak Greek anymore, is the kind of practical foresight into things. She defines it here as what gives the greatest possible overview of all possible standpoints. And she analogizes it to Kant's enlarged mentality. In any case, to some degree, even though for the Greeks, war is anti-political, poetry brought a kind of, and it's anti-political in that it seeks to destroy the other side and thus create a desert of the world. And in doing so, one side is purely victory and one side is defeated. It, though, ameliorates that or mitigates that insofar as that in its poetry, it seeks to save in some way the Trojan world. The other way that the Trojan world is saved, of course, is that Aeneas, a Trojan hero related to Hector in Paris, escapes with a group of Trojan soldiers, and they end up going to Italy and founding Rome, the new Troy. And Arendt makes a lot of this in her writings. Again, if you read the end of the second to last chapter of On Revolution, It is all about the Aeneid. This is a big part. This is a very important idea for her, which she first develops here in these pages. What is it that she's interested in about the Roman and Virgilian idea of war? It is that whereas for the Greeks, war was about annihilation, and they sought to annihilate the Trojans. When Aeneas comes to Italy and comes to Latium and seeks to found his new city, he seeks to do it through a treaty. And even when that treaty is broken by Turnus, after he kills Turnus, he doesn't rout the people. He doesn't annihilate Latium. He executes a treaty with them. And this treaty, Arendt argues, is a completely different idea of war than the Greek idea of war, because it allows the war to end not with a desert, right? A desert of one side winning and the other side disappearing, but the emergence of a new reality, she says, a new common, a new something in common. And on page 177, if you're using the text version. And so she says the Romans save war as political, as politics by other means. So the point here is that the Greeks saw war as annihilation. Today, in the wake of total war, we also see war as annihilation. But for a long period in between, from the Romans all the way up until the 20th century, she wants to argue, another idea of war as political emerged. And that idea of war could allow, could happen, and you could have wars that didn't lead to a reduction of plurality, that actually were political. When politics as without force failed, you ended up with wars, but the wars were not about obliterating peoples. They were about reestablishing new common worlds, so that wars could actually be events that led to a meaningfully new and better peace. And she reads this as part of deep into the Roman psyche, that the very word law for the Romans is lex, which is a lasting tie or a contract. It's what holds human beings together. The first great mythic idea of Roman law is the 12 tables. And unlike Greek lawgivers who were outsiders who came and gave the law, the 12 tables was not given by one man. It was a treaty by the warring factions of Rome, the plebeians and the patricians. And thus she says that very deep into the Roman idea of law is this idea of a treaty, of a compact, of an agreement between the warring parties. And so that's an important part of how she sees the Roman idea of war. Unfortunately, for the Romans, they got too big and they collapsed under their weight, A, and B, in their love of conquest, they eventually lost the Greek Homeric idea of impartiality and saw themselves as too great and everyone else as too awful. And then Arendt returns back to today and the totalitarian wars of annihilation that she had experienced in the 1940s, and that happened also in the 19 teens in World War I. And she says that we are in a position today where wars have lost their political capacity, right? They're no longer a means of politics, a continuation of politics by other means. And that's bad, she says, because we're living in a time of wars and revolutions, right? So that's the next, we didn't read that for today, but if you read the next line from after the section we read for today, she says the age of wars and revolutions, which Lenin predicted for this century, and in fact, and in which we are in fact living, has happened. So if you believe, as Lenin does and as Arendt does, that we are increasingly in an age of wars and revolutions, the fact that war is deeply antagonistic to politics matters, right? And that's the claim that she's making in this section. Okay. So much for an attempt to make some sense of that text. Let's see. I have a couple of questions coming up. You can raise your hand as usual if you have a question. If there are chats, people have questions in the chat. Someone maybe let me know if there's one they'd like reached on. It's hard for me to keep track of the chat and answer all the questions at once. So, first question is Susan Wright, I think.
Okay, yeah, Roger, can you hear me?
I do, yes.
Excellent, excellent, because I'm on my earplug. So I thought this was I just want to preface this by saying I thought this was an incredibly powerful writing by Arendt, and one of the reasons is that I related to it in terms of where we are today, in terms of war, and in the essence of saying that war destroys our relationships. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be, if I'm reading this right, it doesn't have to be a nuclear war. Yeah. It doesn't have to be a physical presence of arms. It's more of the destruction of relationships. And I see that today so much. And I wonder, I wish Arendt was still alive today. Yeah. Because I'd love to know, does she still think we are operating in politics today? It seems so to me like there is this desert that's been created. And I love the idea of, I think you said, or we were talking about, to be able to create a new something in common, which I don't think we are anywhere near that. And yet we have this annihilation today in terms of people's of their opinions. And that's one comment about where are we in politics today? Does politics still exist? Number one. And then number two, there's a lot of talk many times about politics being a meeting of equals. And that's another thing. I don't even know what that means anymore today. I read an article just today where someone was saying, they're not those people who storm the Capitol, they're not my equals. They're a bunch of, beer drinking, blah, blah, blah. Those are not my equals. So that's kind of a comment, but it's also, if I look at all of this where we are today in terms of what she's saying, it's where do we think we are today in terms of her writings about politics, which I think she's right on about, but I can't quite figure out where we are in that because I don't have that distance from it.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if there's comments around that.
Thanks, Susan. Those are important questions. I'll pick I'll let me see what I can do, because you raise a lot of questions. I mean, you asked at one point, does she think there's politics today? She thinks there's a prejudice against politics today, right? That's what this whole book is about, right? And she thinks it gets worse and worse. And she says the two great threats to politics today are the bigness of governments and the rise of bureaucracy. And because both of these, the bigness of governments makes it harder for a group of people to govern in a way that allows for plurality and difference, and it leads to a bureaucratization because it's too big to govern by any small group of people. And what this does is disempowers the population. And so she, I think she sees that as a great threat. She did live through the 60s, and in many ways she was excited by the 60s, right? She thought that the 60s, there were elements of the 60s that showed um, a new love for politics through protest and engagement. But she also was disappointed with much of it and thought that it was often not thought out well enough and more ideological. Um, you know, you referenced, I think the contemporary spirit, the contemporary ideas, and this sense that a lot of us have that politics has become like war today. If you want to put it in this framework, that politics has become an all or nothing game, right? If one side wins, they get everything they want, and if the other side wins, they get everything they want, and they both see the other side as evil and as dangerous. I mean, you see this rhetoric, I think, crystal clear right now. You know, this is what she was writing about. She lived through this in Germany, right? I mean, we have to understand that. Totalitarianism is for her the effort to erase all plurality and thus all freedom from politics. It's through terror to make politics a desert in a country. And so totalitarianism is like what it does in a country what war does between countries. I think one of the questions your question raises, which I'll leave as a question, is to what extent does the militarization of politics that I think you described, Susan, in our contemporary world relate to a rise of totalitarian elements in our politics, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not going to say that we're living in a totalitarian age. I don't think we are. But the desire to have one opinion and one view triumph exclusively in a political world and the other be defeated is at least importantly totalitarian as a drive in Arendt's understanding.
Yeah, yeah, Roger, thank you, because you really brought that out. And I think that's what I've been struggling with, is even though we're going to have a change in political parties, it remains to be seen if we're going to have a change in this political thinking. That's exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, those are hard questions. Does anyone else want to respond to this issue that Susan raised? I think it's good.
Roger, hello, Roger, Bill T here. Susan, I feel like we haven't earned the right to an answer to your question, because I believe we have not really done the housekeeping. Let's just take the US as a microcosm of a world that is trying to be political. Have we really dealt with the we of our country ever? And when we talk about politics of that kind of common world, now I don't want to sound bitter, but I don't think we really do ever really had a common world. And I know that those people, often white people, who feel like they've been looked over, right? They feel you don't see us, therefore we're going to take our country back. And I don't need to tell you about what people of color are now saying, and this is not just the fashionable protests I'm saying here. They're saying we have never been part of this discussion about the we. So the common world is a bit of an illusion, I believe. I don't know what the answer is. It seems like we've got to go back and tell some truth about what we really are, what makes us a nation. Now let's talk about the people who feel that they're not and never have been. And then we can get to the question of, can we really do politics? How do you do politics with people who feel they've been invisible? That's my comment.
It's an excellent comment.
Yeah, I agree.
Can I jump in,
Mara,
Roger?
Go ahead, Mara.
Yeah, thank you. No, I appreciate the comments. In the text, Arendt points to actually two pre-political conditions of possibility in the case for the Greeks. One is a despot who gives the law, before the political realm is constituted. And as we've discussed last week, the other is slavery as the condition of possibility for free men. So right there, you have a limit as to how encompassing the we is. And that's the we, you know, present in the founding of the nation. But an important element, and I don't know whether we actually can juxtapose elements from the Greek understanding and the Roman understanding, is the idea of the societas romana in terms of expanding society. So that is another element to think about. There is a common world. There is a common world that is restricted to some part within this country that had access to that equality and the, I'm going to use this word, you know, intentionally, the privileges, right, of citizenship and belonging. So that's the comment about this.
Can I
have a comment too.
All right, I have two people, Tara and someone else said something. So Tara first, and then whoever was next.
Okay, Shadi was next.
Hi, hi, Shadi.
well, I've written this a couple times in the comments that, you know, I'm really fascinated by her overlap with Marx, and that the condition for equality is freedom from necessity. And that necessity under capitalism has become coercive, that people are not free when they are hungry, when they don't have housing, when their lives are precarious, in that they are susceptible in many, many ways. They can be bought, they can be desperate, they can be violent. And so I think a really enlarging way to think about freedom, and it overlaps with this idea of the condition of slavery that she requires in the Greco example, right? That these people freed themselves from labor by having slaves. And, you know, that is just the fact. That's how she interprets that fact. And how precarious so many lives are. That freedom, that for her entering the space is to be free from coercion. It is to be equal in terms of just being present. I mean, it's very idealized, but I think it is really a blanket insight that she has, and one that really speaks to just the economic decline and precarity that so many people are experiencing, and that our politics is corroded by that.
Thanks,
So
Tara. Shadi, is your comment related to Tara's? Because I would say something in response to her, or I'll let you speak first if you think you want to.
No, mine is back to the original question. So go ahead.
Let me just say one or two things in response to Tara, and then I'll recognize you, Shadi. All right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think, Tara, what you're saying is really right. You know, Arendt makes a couple of distinctions in On Revolution, which is really in many ways the parallel book to this manuscript. And in On Revolution, she makes a distinction between misery and poverty, right? That people who are poor can still be equals in society, as long as they're not, you know, miserable, because they have enough food and they have housing or whatever. They can still participate as equals in a political world. But people who are miserable and don't have that can't, and they become invisible in a way. And so this is part of the distinction she makes between politics and the social that we've talked a little bit about, that for her, in a democracy, nobody should be miserable, but that doesn't mean we should get rid of poverty. The other distinction she makes in On Revolution, as you all know, or many of you know, is that she says the one group of people who were completely invisible and were miserable and yet were ignored, of course, were the two groups, were the Native Americans and the slaves. And she says that slavery, as the result, was this original sin, which and goes exactly to what Bill's saying, that they were not included in the we of the country. And it's in another essay, her essay on civil disobedience, where she says the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were not enough to include Black Americans in the United States. And she says America needs an explicit constitutional amendment to say that the country includes the Native Americans and Blacks and former slaves. She thought that was now I'm not sure that's good enough. I'm not sure would do what Bill's asking, for thinking about the we, but she thought it was an important, she came to think in the 60s that it was something that needed an explicit amendment to the Constitution to include Blacks and former slaves in it. And that strikes me as something that, no one's really talked about, and we talked about reparations, but we haven't talked about an amendment of inclusion. Anyway, Shadi, I'll let you respond.
Hi, can
Sorry, my comment is not that I'm just an engineer, so my question is not that complex or sophisticated, but there's something that struck my mind when I went through the hearing, like representatives talking over the past few days, and lots of them were veterans.
Say that again?
Lots of them were war veterans.
Uh-huh.
And that was something that struck my mind when I read the separation of politics and war. I think Americans are used to this tanglement of people from army being part of the politics. Not that I want to disrespect any members of army or whatever. I know Americans respect or troops, but can you see that? Can you see, why can't anybody see how destructive is it that we have the army part of the whole identity of the country? Like I'm an engineer, a lot of my co-workers are veterans, which is fine, I respect them, but it seems that it's part of the, like nobody questions themselves when you need to question yourself when you're part of a war. Yeah. And then it's just so much embedded in all the parts of the society to just like not ask your question that I'm joining the army. What is the goal of the army? Why am I going? It's not I'm not defending the land. I'm going somewhere else across the globe, and I'm just risking my life. And when I was reading this, it just struck my mind that when it talks about the war and politics and all that this is something that that I don't see. It's a question, and I don't see a lot of people asking these representatives that are talking when they're attacked in the parliament. They're saying, yeah, this wasn't as scary as the war or whatever. So, oh, how many of them have been in the war? And these are politicians, and so yeah, that was my thought when I started reading this from the beginning.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sorry, Roger, can I interrupt for a second? Eduardo wanted to raise a point in the chat room that he would like to reply to Tara. So once you've responded, I think that's Eduardo.
Yeah.
Who
yes,
is that?
I agree.
Oh, Eduardo. Go ahead, Eduardo. Go ahead.
I just wanted to answer Tara, to reply to her, because I don't think Arendt would agree that economic status or economic power would have something to see with political power nowadays, because we are equally superfluous as laboring individuals. So by definition, we have no longer access to politics. And I think the point of this chapter is that it is in the war, in the modern war, where we can all see this superfluous status that we have and the distraction of politics, actually, that we can no longer perceive this distraction of politics in our lives, in the encounter with others, because of our new status as superfluous individuals. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure she would. I mean, are you saying that everybody is superfluous today, Eduardo?
Yes, kind of, and we can feel that in all the fronts that you have.
Yeah.
That you have said.
No,
Facing bureaucracy.
no way, no way.
I mean, okay,
Sorry.
I think there's a way I can try and understand what Eduardo is saying, Clara, which is that to the extent that we abdicate politics and turn it over to bureaucrats, right? We retreat from politics and become politically superfluous. And I think that actually fits also with what Shadi was saying. You know, President Trump nominated a general to be Defense Secretary, General Mattis, and another general to be his chief of staff at the beginning. And now President-elect Biden has nominated a general to be his defense head of Defense Department. This is rarity in the United States. You know, we have not had generals, and they have to get a congressional, you know, they have to be given that permission. Why is this happening? Why are we turning towards generals? It's partly because there's a distrust of politics, and the army is seen as, for better or worse, right? The army is seen as one of the few institutions in our country that's racially integrated, economically integrated, and that is where people trust the army and the people in it to be honorable and have integrity. And so I think it's not in the American tradition that people from the army are very much engaged in politics. It's actually been mostly an exception. But I think you're seeing more and more of that because of what Eduardo is saying. That said, Eduardo, I mean, I think we have to be clear that when she talks of superfluousness in the origins of totalitarianism, she's talking about economic as well as moral and political. And I don't think everyone is. I mean, I think there's a huge difference between people who are economically versus politically superfluous today. I just want to make sure. I assume you agree with that. I just want to make sure that wasn't a confusion. I think that was Clara. Clara, was that what you were going to object to?
Certainly, sir.
Yeah. Okay. I figured that. I just want to make sure that that was cleared up.
Roger, could I say something?
Yeah. Go ahead. I can't see who that is.
Susan Tucker.
Hi, Susan.
Yeah, I just wanted to get back to the question of the we that Bill raised, because I wanted just to make 2 points. I mean, I think I think Hannah Arendt has a lot to teach us. I think in terms of her vision of America, I think she had a very romanticized vision. And that when she said things like, yes, there's a problem with slavery, and yes, there's a problem with African Americans being Native Americans and African Americans, but then she goes on to expound her theory anyway, and not really treating those realities, those mortal sins, as a major impediment and contradiction, I think, in terms of her romantic idea of the commons, for example. And I think we're seeing it today. I mean, I'm disturbed, for example, by Biden's continuing to talk about a we and our integrity as a people without acknowledging, I mean, how can he even talk like that when at least, a lot of African Americans were really important in terms of his getting elected, number one, but number two, just the reality in which we're living. So I think that people like him and all of us need to be much more careful when we talk about we, because it's a bifurcated we. Mm-hmm. And it's a fundamental flaw. And it's something that I agree, if we don't deal with it, like really deal with it, as opposed to Band-Aids. It seems to me that throughout American history, even to the extent that we've been willing to confront this issue, it's always, well, we really should do X, but we're not going to do X because it's too expensive and we really don't want there to be equality. So we do other things instead. And
Yeah,
then
I mean,
we end
Susan,
up,
I think there's a
then
good
we end
point.
up where we are now.
I mean, this goes back to the question I was sort of raising, which is how do you do it, right? One answer is Arendt's answer at that point in 1967 or so, when she wrote that, is a constitutional amendment of inclusion. You know, look what Biden's doing. He's without a doubt the most diverse cabinet we've ever had in this country. Now,
Well, it might be racially diverse. It's not necessarily politically diverse.
well,
But
that's
anyway,
true.
go ahead.
But it's gender diverse. It's got its first Native American cabinet member. I mean, he's done. All I'm saying is there's an effort. We can argue about whether it's good enough. But you're right. It's very much not politically diverse. But what kind of diversity, you know, are we after? I just want to just raise that. Dina, you're up next, and yeah, let's go on.
I was wondering what clue, if any, we can glean from the title of this work, Introduction into Politics. For me, that evokes the idea of politics as an activity, something fluid, as opposed to a static, closed-off concept. Maybe that also goes towards the idea of hers of politics as a plurality. And then that could be an entryway of thinking about, quote unquote, a we. Because if politics is a plurality, then I think what she's saying in part is that the more plural, the more viewpoints are, different viewpoints are included, the more, the bigger the we becomes. But it's not a we of identities, but it's a we of separate individual viewpoints. And that part can be expanded.
That's all right. And I think there's two ways that the into is operative, at least. And one is, as you said, as an activity, right? That you politics is something you practice by appearing and talking and acting with others. And the other into aspect is that politics is a space. She has a spatial theory of her. She's a very spatial thinker. And politics happens in a polis, in a political world, that has to be set up either by laws in the Greek sense of a lawgiver, or through a contract or treaties or negotiations. And she sees politics as something that happens in a space for politics. It's not something that happens naturally, and you need to care for that space. You need to have that space nurtured where people can and feel comfortable appearing and speaking their mind in ways that they are going to be heard. Doesn't mean they have to be agreed with, but heard. And so I think both of those are ways that Introduction into Politics reads as a, yeah.
And I just wanted to add, it's not Introduction to Politics, because that would be a definitive definition of what politics in fact is.
That's right.
Here it is. And it's not an introduction in politics, because that would be the actual doing of politics, which she can't do by herself in a written document, because doing politics is the act of speaking with one another.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's really important. Thank you. James Kyberg.
Roger, I want to get back. I want to celebrate what it is that we are doing. This idea of commonality, this experience of commonality, this experiencing of allowing ourselves to come to the table and think together and listen to each other, as was evidenced on page 128. Only in the freedom of our speaking with one another does the world emerge in its objectivity and visibility from all sides. Living in a real world and speaking with one another about it are basically one and the same. For me, in my life, this time with you guys has been that commonality for me. Last week, one of our members mentioned how his sister didn't trust any white people. And I was shocked because I don't trust any white people. And I said, why is that? And I had to think about that.
Is this your egg?
I'm sorry?
Is that yours?
Why is that? I've taken a lot of Alexander training. And the Alexander trainer said to me, James, it's very interesting to me. You exhibit a habit that is rare, but when one's, as a youth, baby, one's mortal coil is taken by those who are supposed to feed you and love you, they exhibit these habits. And I, in my lifetime, have exhibited these habits. It's a version of PTSD. I feel as though we in America are suffering this huge PTSD from racism. We are verging on swallowing ourselves up in the pus of racism, and we're about to drown in it. None of the people that I saw going towards the Capitol last week were thinking. They're not thinking. It's not about right or left or right or liberal or conservative. It's about, are we thinking? Our time together for me has taught me what thinking and listening, how rich and that can be. And my question is this time together that we're spending, is this politics? Is this the opportunity of politics? And the other question I have is, what the hell is the desert?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. Really, first of all, I really appreciate your what you said about the group. You know, you raised an excellent question there too, but let me stick with the bigger one. Is this politics? First of all, let me say that I think the group is great. It has its strengths and weaknesses. And, you know, there's two reasons at least that it's not, there's a few reasons that I think it's not pure politics, right?
Roger,
One is,
somebody, excuse me, somebody is banging pots and it's really loud.
oh yeah, someone, can you mute yourself if you're the one banging pots? Please.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Daphne. Daphne.
Looks like James is.
What? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So, one reason it's not politics is my fault because I'm sort of the leader of this group. And, you know, to the extent I'm the leader, you know, it's not a group, you know, that would be, you know, if I come across as someone who's supposed to be the person transmitting some knowledge, that separates me, and that's a problem. And so the group, in my estimation, straddles a line between being more of a political group and more of a group where I'm also offering some expertise. And that's something I've thought a lot about. I've talked to many of you about it. You know, in many ways, so that's one weakness. That's one place where I think it falls short of being political. Another would be that, you know, there's a certain bias of who comes to this group. You know, this is not you know, I mean, there's a lot of pluralism in this group, but there's also a lot of, you know, there's a bias. And I think it's more of a social group in that sense. It's a group of people interested in talking about political life through Hannah Arendt, and it's somewhat elitist and esoteric. You know, I wish we had more people who were unlike us, and yet, you know, it's a group on Hannah Arendt. So how are you going to really deal with that problem? It's got that limitation. And that also leads to, you know, a class and race representation problem in who's here as well. So, you know, I think there's I think there's a lot of ways in which it's, James, a public sphere group. And it's a kind of talking society that Arendt talks about, where people get together and talk about problems. And yet it's not, I don't think, political in her sense for some of the reasons I just mentioned. Although I think it does model a kind of how to have, I hope, uh, a meaningful discussion about something with people you don't always agree with. And I hope that is a model for it. And in that sense, encourages the habit of thinking with others and enlarged thinking that would be helpful in a political group of its type.
Did you read Timothy Snyder's The American Abyss in the New York Times?
Yeah, I think I sent out a link about it in yesterday's Amor Mundi.
The fabric of factuality.
Yep.
Big lies exist only in lonely minds.
Yeah.
The coherent substitutes for the experience of companionship. I don't experience lonely minds here.
Well, I think in a way, like I said, I think we are modeling a kind of public discourse. And, you know, and as Bill reminds me sometimes, it's a little bit, you know, abstract and not fiery enough, maybe. But it's an attempt to model what she would call political discourse is, which is a discourse amongst people you disagree with without violence, based on persuasion.
What is the desert?
But the desert for her is the destruction of plurality. So if we were to say anyone who doesn't like Hannah Arendt can't come to this group, we would banish those people, and that would be like a desert. That would create a desert of that kind of group. But we don't say that. You know, I'm happy to have people who don't like Hannah Arendt come to the group and fight with me on it, as long as they do it respectfully. Nick. Nick, are you still here?
Yes, I'm still here. Thank you very much. I kind of want to go back to Bill's point. My assessment of Hannah Arendt's thinking is she doesn't emphasize a politics of inclusion, unlike somebody like a liberal Democrat philosopher like Rorty does. The closest, like for instance, in our reading that gives a politics of inclusion is her idea of phrenesis, of the enlarged mentality from Kant, that gives us in a plurality several perspectives and puts us in the shoes of the other person, thus encouraging inclusion, if you will. But in her writings, her emphasis is more on the agonistic character of politics, in that it faces people among one another to debate and to argue and to win. It's a politics of fame, if you will, that one gets immortality and fame from being able to engage in this struggle and to overcome. So that to me is like, and that is to her kind of the her being enamored with a Greek thinking, I think, puts her in that place where she puts down life, like her idea of us being too engaged with life, with the lowest form of the animal laborans, putting life as the greatest good is itself wrong, because politics doesn't do that. Politics is above that. And that to me is a reversion, because what happens is that in an agonistic world, that conflict, that war idea especially encourages that conflict and I don't know, makes war a great thing or something, because it's a conflict between people. Whereas if life was the greatest good, which she denies, if life were the greatest good, then we would avoid that conflict. We would avoid the war. So I don't look at her as a political thinker that thinks that of inclusion, more of a political thinker that wants us to engage one another in conflict for the purpose of in some ways fame, if you will.
I think it's a good point, Nick. You know, what I'll say is, you know, she doesn't think life is unimportant. Let's just be very clear. She has great respect for life. And I think one of the, as we're going to start reading The Human Condition in 3 weeks. And when we do, we'll spend a fair bit of time on the section on labor, which is life. And I think one of the mistakes of many people who read the book is to think she demeans labor or demeans life, which she doesn't do at all. She actually has great respect for the importance of life and labor. Her worry, it's not that she thinks politics and action is more important than labor. She thinks that two things. One is that action is the more distinctively human aspect of the human condition, because lots of other things are alive besides humans, right? Plants, animals, etc. Whereas she thinks that only humans can act politically. And then secondly, she thinks that, and so there's a human exceptionalism in Arendt that is undeniable. And, some people I think today really reject, especially people who talk about, we shouldn't say human rights, we should say plant rights or animal rights. Arendt is without a doubt a human exceptionalist, and we can have there's going to be people who dispute that today. And so one aspect of it is that she thinks action is more human. And the second is that she thinks that action is being lost because of an overemphasis on life. And so she's trying to hold on to an aspect of a faculty of the human condition and of human beings that she thinks is being increasingly lost in the modern world. So that's why she focuses on these, but it's not at all at the denigration of life. But I think you're right in everything else you say. I mean, I think you're right in what you say. I just tried to put that in perspective.
Yeah, and I do agree with you too, Roger. She doesn't do that. But I think at one reading she did compare life and action and in relation to what is the greatest good, if you will. And I think when she talked about life being the greatest good, she talked about it in a terms that she didn't agree with that, because if it as human beings, she felt like in action there was this chance to gain immortality. There was this chance to become bigger than ourselves, and that was where the attraction of politics or the realm of politics gave us a chance to become that, to immortalize, and that was the greatest good. I in my reading, I need to reread her again. I look forward to the next to the human condition, because that is where everything.
A lot of this will be, obviously, this is the foundation for the human condition in many ways. So.
And I think maybe she reverses herself in the human condition from some of these things that we're reading now. And that would be an interesting thing to see as well.
Okay, we'll keep that in mind. Thanks, Nick. Layla, I'm sorry.
Hi, Roger. Thank you very much.
Is it Lila or Layla's?
Layla.
Layla, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Just like the song, Layla. So, okay. So first, I think this was for me one of the best texts I have read for Arendt so far. I need to reread The Human Condition again, but I think it's also explains a lot. But I think also in correspondence to many questions that have been raised and many points, I would say I want to just invite us all to rethink what does she mean by freedom, and how she actually assesses freedom as part of equality between peers. So the question is, what constitutes peers in our world? So how are we equal? And she always repeats this idea of equality between peers freed from their naked necessities. So also then the second question will be, is what are today's naked necessities? So because it changed and the human affairs have changed and the way the power structure and the society and what it means has changed as well. And maybe the second thing, maybe in more of closer to Bill's question, I think she also separates between the political life in the public sphere, and the life in the non-private, so not in the household. And she makes it very clear that how communal life, at least on a household level, it is actually not political, but it's actually not political at all. It's more of a power structure, and there's inequality in the household. However, it is like unharmful inequality that people come to agreements of how to live together by somehow being listening or having to follow the rules inside the house. But it's not a world of equals, it's more of a world that people who agree somehow to live together. So the question will be, is what defines the life in the commune is more or less is like a rules of conduct, if we can call them so. So how do we agree to live within the power structures, because we cannot all be equals in the same sense. So we have like spheres of equals, and these spheres somehow intersect in certain levels. But to become political, at least in the Greek sense that she has portrayed all the time, it is totally different. And the third point that I would like to also invite all of us to rethink about is how today's world wars are more of cultural wars. And these cultural wars is about, that starts from the destruction of other people's existence, and how the relationship between the people is portrayed in culture, in traditions, and how by eliminating these traditions and looking at them as they are backwards or like they're not modernized enough, how do we actually eliminate the existence of the other people? And that reaches when you destroy the residence. I'm not talking about monuments and cultural significance, but the residence, where people live and they practice their human affairs, the relationship that comes between people as communal. It is the largest way of actually destruction of these affairs, turning the land into desert, as she explains it. But it is also that this world cannot reproduce itself. So what she says also, it is with war, somehow there's another world that comes to life. But when we do not allow this world to come to life, then this is a full annihilation of the other. So maybe these are the points that I wanted to highlight. And for me, the most important one is this cultural extermination of others. Like, how do we render others unequal by looking at them as backwards? Because we do not understand how this works. Yeah, and thank you for having this amazing group.
Well, thank you, Leila. Yeah, I think one of the interesting questions is, to what extent we have wars today, right? And what is a war? If you define war as she does, as total war, most of the wars that have been fought post World War II have not been total wars, because people are scared of the full war. They don't want to use nuclear weapons. They don't want to use other things.
Yeah, now we call them terrorism. So when
and so we move from war to terrorism, or skirmishes, or eternal wars, or border wars, or whatever it is. And so one of the issues is that, I wrote about this a number of years ago, and you can imagine it got a lot of controversy. But one of the problems we have right now is that if you really do believe, as she did, that war was an important part of politics, the making war impossible is one of the things that leads to an incapacity of politics to solve some of our most burning questions, right? It used to be that if there was a political stalemate, you'd have a war and one side would win, and the sort of status quo would be reset. But we can't reset the status quo, right? Whether it's between the United States and Russia during the Cold War, or US and or China now, or the Israeli and Palestinians, or other groups, there's too much fear. And so if you take war off the table, you have sort of like interminable conflicts, which makes politics more dangerous, which turns people away from politics, which leads into all of these problems. And so I think these are questions she raised in a lot of her work, especially in some of her writings on war, both in the On Revolution and in On Violence. Yeah, I mean, you asked a good question about, what is freedom and how does it relate to necessities? I mean, it's a bigger question, but I'll just say just quickly, freedom in its most basic sense for Arendt is acting in concert with others. And as you said, who are equal. And what does it mean to be equal? Free from necessity. She never defines that. Let me just be clear. She says in On Revolution, which I already mentioned, that miserable people and people who are enslaved or in camps are obviously not equal. She says in 1974 in Toronto in a conference on her work, when she's pushed on this question, she says, well, everyone needs a place to live and food, right? And she says those aren't really political questions. Those are just what everyone needs in order to be able to become political. And so that's as much as I have known her to say on these matters, Layla. I mean, it's as close as she gets.
But maybe I just want to expand this a little bit and ask, so if then being political is out of choice, so if I want based on Arendt's thinking, so do I get to choose to not to be political if
Yes.
I am freed from my naked necessities? And then what does it make me? Does it make me like I exclude myself from action within concert, that it actually makes me living in the desert as just a biopolitical existence?
Yeah, so what she says is there's never been any civilization in history where everyone wants to be political. And what she says is everyone has to have the right to be political and the capacity. And after that, there will be those who want to do it. And she calls them a political elite, but not in the sense of an economic elite and not in the sense of an elite chosen by anyone else, but a self-chosen political elite who decide to engage in these kind of world-building conversations. And she says at times more people might join and other times people might feel like they don't want to, but no, you don't have to. And but she would like to set up a system where it's as easy to do it as possible and the incentives are there to do it.
So I will follow that with only one last comment. So what about responsibility in that case? So if I am able to be political and I choose not to be, what about my responsibility towards the communal life that is actually enabling me to live a good life and not be political?
Yeah, you're maybe not living up to your responsibility, but we can't force you to be responsible. That would be like a Rousseauian idea of forcing you to be free. And Arendt's not into that.
Roger, if you can maybe comment a little more on that, because this brings me to the old concept of Arendt and polis envy. I think it was Richard Wolman or something. I mean, this is something that goes through all her writing, has been critiqued in the past in regards not just to African Americans, but basically to other populations.
Well, I mean, if by polis envy, you mean envy of the Greeks,
yes.
I mean, she doesn't really build this on the Greeks. I mean, her examples for this are, well, certainly, the United States in its early days with town hall meetings, France and the debating societies in the 18th century, the Soviets in Russia, the Hungarian workers' councils in Hungary. These are the sort of touchstones of her thinking. Now, is she interested in them because of an envy of the Greek polis? I think, well, let me put it this way. I don't think she has an envy of the Greek polis. I mean, I don't think she would want to live in Greece. I mean, first of all, she would not be a citizen in Greece as a woman. She had no illusions, I think, about that. She does think that our word politics comes from the Greek politeia, polis, and our tradition of politics comes from the Greek polis. And so she takes that very seriously, and she believes that the concepts that the Greeks worked out, which have lasted, she thinks have lasted because they're meaningful. So I think if she has an envy, I don't think she has an envy for the actual way the Greeks lived and the way they did things, but I think she takes great. I think she's deeply inspired by the Greek the Greek thinking. You know, she sees ideas in it. Now I think, you know, I forget who just brought it up, but you know, it was Layla who brought up this idea of free from necessity. Well, Amrita Sen, you know, it would be the sort of modern thinker who's thought most about what does it mean today? What are the minimum what does he call it? Minimum conditions of I forget what he calls it, minimum, but it's like the minimum conditions of being able to be a free and equal citizen. Right. You know, I think Arendt would have much lower minimum conditions than Amrita Sen would have. But that's just that's an interesting argument. That's not I think that's they're on the same basic wavelength. But I don't, you know, I don't think of Arendt as someone nostalgic for Greece. It's just not something that I find in her writing at all. I think she takes seriously Greek writers, Roman writers, Italian writers, French writers. I think she does think that some of the Greeks were the beginning of our political tradition and our philosophical tradition, and we take them seriously. But, you know, I think she has much more envy for living in Rome than she did for Greece, just to give you one example. And above both of those, I think she would put New England in the 18th century. You know, I think that's in many ways, and she would have liked you know, as she says, the Hungarian workers' communes. I mean, you know, I think if you look at the kinds of political movements she talks about, they're not all in Greece. Stephen Greenleaf, you're next.
I just want to go back to actually what part of the reading Nick had addressed earlier, but look at it from the other way, and that is about phronesis and Kant on judgment. And you remarked that the issue was whether courage or phronesis was a more important political trait, but without weighing into that, this seems to me a really important point. And that if we look at successful politicians, people who successfully address and resolve conflicts, that this large-mindedness, this ability to take the perspective of others is absolutely crucial. And as I look around today's political scene, it seems to be in very short supply. And I think in part because it's a great challenge when we can be so divided. But yeah, that's all I had to say, is I think this is a very, very important point.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, you know, Pierre Clastres was an anthropologist who died very young, but he's written some of the best political anthropology around. And he talks about the political leaders of native societies in South America who he studies. And he says that what a king is, or what a leader is in these societies, is someone who has no other power but stands up and speaks what he thinks. Usually he is what shares is what the tribe shares, and either people agree with him and gather around him and he becomes the king, or not. And that's very much how I think Arendt understands kingship and leadership in politics. The politico, the politician, is someone who's able to speak in a way that a plurality of people who often disagree with him and are different from him or her gather around and accept the vision of the collective that they offer. And so that requires a certain openness and humility and phrenesis and judgment, and courage to get up there and speak and know that if they don't like you, they might kill you or who knows what. But I think that's what again, without, I hope, being exhibiting Paulus envy, I think that's how she finds what she finds in the political tradition starting in Greece, that a politician is one who doesn't impose anything on the community, but speaks in a way such the community finds themselves in the unity that has been articulated by the political speaker.
I would also add, I suspect that in part, the reason people often don't like politicians, even successful politicians, perhaps even most successful politicians, is they perceive a certain hypocrisy in their multiplicity of viewpoints. Well, obviously, there is rank, gross hypocrisy, abundant in today's news, but in other circumstances, I think it's much more subtle phenomena and reflects a multiplicity of perspectives and judgments that make their ability to persuade others.
You're absolutely right. And one of the things Arendt says in a number of places is that our disdain for hypocrisy is deeply dangerous. I mean, now obviously there's gross hypocrisy, but what she says is that, hypocrisy is the complement vice pays to virtue. You need a certain amount of hypocrisy. None of us, as she says, would want what we really think in our heart of hearts to be published in front of us as we walk down the street. There's not one of us who doesn't have thoughts that would be deeply embarrassing to us if they were widely known. And so she says, a certain amount of hypocrisy is necessary for politics. And I think that's a brilliant insight and one that we should all learn from.
Agree.
Nancy.
Yeah, I was going to get back to the description of what we're doing in this group and James's comments, and then the ongoing discussion we've had that Bill T has sustained about who is the we in the United States, but also who is the we. I just wanted to sort of make a distinction between our reading of Hannah Arendt's works and our interactions within the group as two different kinds of activity, so that it's fascinating to me to try to analyze how on a micro level this particular group is or isn't being political and is or isn't experiencing changes of minds, which I think is something that might be a necessity if you're going to make any kind of headway toward any kind of plateau in which there can be a political activity that works. I know I'm not saying that quite right, but the idea of conversation and a space like an agora where conversation can take place seems to somewhat characterize this group. Whether you, Roger, are leading it or not, there's still the possibility that anyone who's here can articulate a point of view.
So Nancy, let me just ask you, I mean, I think you're right. And I'd like to believe you're even more right than I think, but I think you're mostly right. But, if we were to be a political group, we really couldn't call ourselves a Hannah Arendt reading group, right?
Right.
Because, I mean, it's like you can't have a political group that's a chess club because it excludes people who aren't interested in chess.
Right.
And we're supposed to bring everybody in.
I agree.
So that's where, that was part of the other point. I mean.
Yeah. Well, I think that we are at least two different things at one time. I think in
Mhm.
some ways we resemble the people who were talking in the Academy of Plato in some ways.
You flatter us.
Well, I mean, in the sense that we're interested in the big picture, we're interested in sharing observations to the extent that we listen to one another.
Yeah.
I think that we are in some ways practicing politics in the way that Hannah Arendt is talking in some ways.
And let's
But,
remember that these distinctions between the private, the social, and political are always porous. We are a social political group, if you'd like to call it that, right? We do social in the sense that we're interested in Hannah Arendt. We do political in that it's a public conversation that's open, it's online, anyone can watch it. And we're obviously trying to persuade each other of different views. So
Roger, could I just say something about that? The thing that this is Susan Wright. The thing that occurs to me that's very different, Nancy, about this type of a group, and I belong to a few of these. I've also attended many political town halls in my different towns that I've lived in. The key difference to me is what's at stake. So what's at stake here for us is, at the best, maybe a change of mind, a good, excellent discussions, excellent analytical thinking that Arendt would have loved. Why are we thinking these things? How do we get to those conclusions? But in the town hall discussions, when you're talking about economic realities, that things that are going to, it's a whole different ball game. It's what's at stake for their individual lives. And as wonderful as this is, I don't know that any of us come out of this or sit here thinking, oh my God, what is this going to mean to me tomorrow if I have to send my kid to school? You know what I mean? That's politics in a different way that I think is an important discussion, but it's different. And I don't even know that the Greeks really experienced it the way modern America and other countries do today. I just needed to insert that. Yeah.
Helpful.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank
That's
you.
really important, Susan. Andy, we'll get the last question because we're running out of time. We actually are 5 minutes over. So quickly, Andy.
Oh, in that case, I feel bad because I'm pretty sure Dina had put her hand up first.
Dina, you
Oh,
already.
please go ahead. Yeah, I'm done.
Fine. That's why, because it must have stayed up. Okay, that makes sense. I wanted. Well, thank you. This is the first time here.
Welcome.
It's been wonderful so far. I wish I'd been here earlier. I will be here for all of the human condition. So thank you. No, I just wanted to get back to the desert. I thought it was one of the most interesting aspects, but for me, it sort of struck this idea that there is politics requires a balance between two versions of the almost like a Hobbesian state of war. On one side, a state of almost too much pluralism, where forces are just trying to dominate each other without any commonality, and when there's victory, there will just be a reduction in the plural. That's a really difficult word to say. Reduction in the plurality of sort of human experience. But on the other side, once commonality, once one particular view is established, and if that exists in a state of totalitarianism, then you've got equally a version of the desert where it's almost as bad as living in a state of nature in a lot of in the sort of war anyway, particularly when you can't do the Hobbesian things that politics allows you to get out of. So safety, security, and being able to plan for the future and those types of things. But what I thought was really interesting, I mean, I'm in London, so I'm only slightly better than the people in the States at the moment in terms of our own culture wars. Someone referenced the sort of ongoing culture wars, and I had not thought of them as being so put through an Arendtian framework. They actually terrify me more than sort of other types of warfare, because it is that type of it's a type of absolute domination. It is an attempt to reduce the pluralism that people experience. So I wanted to ask it to bring in the sort of desert and the culture wars.
Oh, thanks, Andy, and welcome to the group. The desert is a metaphor. Arendt, I'm not sure if it's the first time, but it first introduces in at the end of the origins of totalitarianism. In the chapter, she adds ideology and terror at the very end. It's one that she uses to describe totalitarianism quite a bit. In totalitarianism, where everything is, where terror reigns, there's just there's no difference, there's no plurality. The world is like a desert. It's all the same color, the same quality, etc. Here, she's using it in, I think, a similar way, but the desert is the loss of plurality, the loss of, if you want to call it in a metaphorical way, biodiversity. It's where everything is the same. And whether that happens in a totalitarian state through terror, or whether that happens through the annihilation of a people and the wiping them off the face of the earth, which is why she says that genocide is in her mind, the only true crime against humanity. Because if at core humanity is to be part of a pluralistic world, genocide attacks that plurality. It attacks a group of people, a kind of people, whatever people that is. And in the same way, she thinks totalitarian war or total war seeks to wipe out a people and bring about that kind of desert. So I think, yeah, it's a metaphor she uses a fair bit in this period.
In the same, could I?
Just follow, because I sort of forgot. I tried to write down to keep my question coherent, and then I sort of messed it up. But what I think was, looking at the states in particular at the moment, what looks to be missing is that actually less so that you've got a lot of pluralism going on, but the commonality is also required. The commonality is equally required, to get out of that state of nature. The theoretical contract has to agree upon something to live under some common rules, and that's, she talks about that a lot in here. This sort of Roman idea of the laws, that you can have that pluralism, but you all have to agree on something.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, and I think you saw, like when in the riots or mobs or coup or whatever you want to call it, that happened on the 6th, you saw a kind of commonality emerge in response, right? 92% of the country thinks those people were wrong. That's pretty good. And the Congress decided to meet right away and certify things. So yeah, I mean, it's very rare to see that these days. And yet, there are moments when we at least, I think, still know what we don't like. Well, hopefully it will last. The president of my college, Leon Botstein, who's a brilliant Renaissance thinker and musician, but also a historian, wrote a letter to us all this week saying, that, well, as Governor Schwarzenegger, some of you may have saw what he wrote, where he said that this reminded him of Kristallnacht. President Botstein said, that's the wrong, while that was well-meaning, it was the wrong reference, because Kristallnacht was already during a Nazi period when democracy had ended. More apt is the Munich beer hall putsch of 1933 or 4. Or no, when was it? The Munich beer hall putsch. It was actually before 33.
Earlier.
It was in the 20s, right?
1923 or thereabouts.
23, right. It was
24,
23.
yeah.
That's what it is. But we should all remember that, right? Because the Nazi Bierhold Putsch was an attempt of the Nazis, including Hitler, to storm the Munich government. And they lost, they were put down, and they were put in jail, including Hitler. And 10 years later, they came back and won the election in 1932 and 33. That's, I think, if you want to be fearful about the moment we're in, that's the analogy to hold on to and to look into. Because if we simply congratulate ourselves and say, oh, this was nothing, we won, you know, these people are going to be put in jail, they're going to be prosecuted, and think, you know, don't worry about it, this resentment grows unless you deal with it. And that's the lesson I think Andy's talking about to some degree, and a lot of you others as well. Somehow, you know, you can't just keep repressing this. And, you know, that's the challenge for us going forward. Spiros, did you want, I saw you try to say something. I didn't.
Yes, Roger, thanks. Okay. In the same metaphorical and poetic rhetoric or mood, Arendt talks about desert storms. And at the same time, in Capital, we say the storm against Capital. So maybe Capital or things like that are desert storms. Desert is the final condition, which means the end of politics, but we are now living in the era of desert storms.
Well, on that happy note, I wish you all a happy weekend and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. So we're going to finish this book for next week. We actually have many fewer pages. So, you know, I hope you enjoy it, and feel free to bring in questions about the whole book, or at least the whole introduction into politics manuscript. And we will meet next Friday and finish it up. And then we have a week off, and then we start the human condition.